Okay, I know I'm talking to every parent out there. Life with little kids can be a juggling act. Luna's got dance, Miles has basketball, plus they both have school and their own personalities. And now we've got a little baby in the house. But I wouldn't trade being a dad for anything in the world. I love being there for my special moments with my kids. That's why my health is such a priority to me and why I got an updated COVID-19 booster. My family did too. I encourage you to
His
talk to
family
your
did.
healthcare provider and go to vaccines.gov to check eligibility and schedule an appointment today.
I just want to.
Can be a juggling act.
Where is it?
Luna's got dance.
There you go. These are the eyes of a compromised soul. I know what people are thinking. Hashtag confession through projection. Maybe I'm projecting. The eyes are the window to the soul, and these are the windows to a compromised soul. Now, some people are saying, how much did Pfizer pay you for this ad? There are various ways of compromising an individual: bribery, threats, promises, whatever. John Legend, in as much as I've never listened to his music, I haven't, is compromised. I'll say that's my personal belief, because these are the eyes of someone who does not
Miles
believe what they are saying.
has basketball.
Now, get this out of here. I say there could not have been any more of a, what's the word, apropos intro for today's stream. John Legend has been bought through hook or crook by Pfizer, and he's pitching the jibby jab on adults, children. Oh, by the way, they're not even calling it an updated vaccine anymore, as if that ever made sense. They're calling it an updated booster. An updated booster. He and his family have gotten it, and I've got questions. Now, speaking of sponsors, I would not accept a sponsor from Pfizer. I would only accept sponsors from companies that I feel good about. And you may have noticed that this stream does contain a sponsorship. Now, I started 5 minutes early because Dr. Gu might have to duck out at a hard 1 hour, and I don't want the intro to eat into the time of the stream. This is going to be interesting. But before we even get to there, let me just do my sponsors. There's two of them tonight. We're going to start with Birch Gold, people. And let me just make sure that we're seeing this properly so I don't screw it up. Birch Gold. Okay. There are things that I don't mind endorsing. Gold is one of them. Birch Gold, as are the Biden administration's New Year's goals of tax and spend, turn a blind eye to inflation. But the bottom line is I'm going to skip the details of inflation. It's hard to make money. It's easy to lose it. And when you make money, and even if you stick it in the bank, you're losing money based on inflation. What are a dozen eggs costing these days? Gold has been a time-tested, true investment for 5,000 years, worth its weight in gold, yada, yada, yada. We know that. We know the expressions. It has proven the test of time over and over again. When you buy gold from a company like Birch Gold, you're getting good gold, 99.999, whatever. You're getting precious metals. You're not buying better precious metals from certain companies. You're buying better service from certain companies. Birch Gold, for thousands and thousands of positive ratings, A triple plus or A plus rating with the Bureau of Better Businesses, yada, yada. 5-star reviews. They will roll over your 401k into precious metals. You can buy beautiful little gold coins that you can sit on. You'll not 10x your investment, but you will not, overnight, but you won't 10x loss overnight like you would with FTX. Birchgold.com. Promo code Viva. You'll get a free intro kit, and you'll learn how to buy gold, how to invest, how to make sure that you don't lose the hard-earned money that you've worked so hard to earn. And speaking of worth its weight in gold, people, the second sponsor for tonight, for Patriots. And this was a little more interesting, a little more pressing. With we have spy balloons flying over America. We got people sabotaging grids, power grids. National security experts are warning our aging power grid is more vulnerable than ever. There were 3 attacks on power grids in January. Imagine, I just moved to Florida. We just had Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Nicole. I picked up a diesel generator, didn't open the box, and thank goodness I didn't, because I returned it because my parents were like, David, you're going to kill yourself with that generator. For Patriot, they have generators, portable generators, solar paneled generators that you can power up with the sun. You don't need diesel. They're easy to use. They're portable. They're reliable. You need nothing more than the power of the sun so that you can charge your generator, have it be good for a year. Fantastic. They have small panels, big panels, all sorts of stuff. forpatriots.com. Let me just see if I want to make sure that I'm not missing out on anything. Yes, that's right. Promo code Viva. You get 10% off your first purchase. Anything that they have at the store on the online site. They're on Fox News. It's fantastic stuff. And it's stuff that you're going to probably need, probably want to use regardless, especially if you go camping, and especially if you live in hurricane-prone areas, and especially if you live in areas where people just, go on random shooting sprees of power grids. PatriotGold.com, promo code Viva. BirchGold.com. Thank you very much to both of those companies. The links are in the description. 35 seconds into the 1 hour that I have with Dr. Gu. Now, I'm going to say this before Dr. Gu comes in. I was listening to Dr. Gu on the Twitter Spaces. I've been following him indirectly on Twitter for a little while, and I liked the fact that Dr. Gu was not shy to jump into what could only be described as a hostile environment, because in some of these Twitter Spaces, the majority of the people who are engaged on Twitter, engaged online, are not ideologically aligned necessarily with the prevailing narrative, safe and effective, yada, yada, yada. I like the fact that Dr. Gu was not scared to be in an environment where the majority of the people listening were not on his side ideologically, politically, medically. And I reached out and he said he's going to come on and talk about it, because I've got some questions. I've got lots of questions. What is safe? What is effective? And does Dr. Gu feel betrayed by the community, the medical community of which he's been a part for a while? Because in these Twitter Spaces, I'm listening to Dr. Gu, and I think I'm seeing an evolution, but I might be projecting. I think I'm seeing someone who's starting to ask questions that other people were asking long ago. Not me. People were asking these questions before me. I think I see a transition. I might just be projecting. Maybe there isn't, and we'll see. But he agreed to come on, and I'll give him full credit for agreeing, because I don't know if his brethren are going to judge him now for having fraternized with the Viva. Dr. Gu, I see you in the background. I'm going to bring you in 3, 2, 1. Booyah. Sir, how goes the battle?
Hey, Viva. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. And it's a sincere thank you, because I know you're going to say a lot of things which I'm probably going to vehemently disagree with and find maybe even very objectionable. But you seem open for discussion, which is rare, in my experience, rarer on one side of the aisle than the other. I reach out to a lot of people, and I know who says yes. I know who says no or doesn't respond, and I don't like embarrassing people who I reach out to, but you're one of a very rare few from that side, as people would see it, who agreed to come on. And I got questions. So before we get started.
Well, I know, before we get started, I just want to say, I never liked echo chambers, and I can tell from a lot of the comments and everything, it's a hostile crowd towards me, right? You can even tell on the stream and the comments you see on the side. But, I just don't like the fact that a lot of people, either on the right or the left, they only like to talk to their crowd who just echoes whatever they say. And there's no critical thinking. So I think, it keeps me on my toes to talk to people who are against me. Hopefully we can do it in a civil way with respect on both sides. I know we can't control the comments of everybody, and people are free to say whatever they wish to say. But I just want to have, an open conversation that is civil and respectful.
Don't read the chat, Dr. Gu. I will. People don't appreciate, like, my Twitter persona might be a little harsher than me in reality. I'm always respectful, especially with people who are open for discussion. So just don't read the chat, because the internet's the internet.
Definitely. And I know you probably get some flack for having me on too from your people.
I had people say they're not going to watch it. I said, if you don't watch it, it's your loss. But I'm not going to bring up any abusive or hostile comments. I'm not trying to make you feel uncomfortable. I'm happy you're here. The 30,000 foot overview, who you are, by the way, because you have an interesting past. If I had more time, I'd go into childhood, but if you could, like, childhood to now and credentials, because whether or not people agree or disagree with you, love you or hate you, you still have credentials. So if you could give us the brief overview of your childhood, where you're from, how you ended up where you are, and your credentials.
Yeah, would love to. Thank you. So, I was born and raised in San Francisco. My mom came here from Seoul, Korea. My dad came here from Nanjing, China. They met at San Francisco State University, and that's kind of like how I was born. I don't speak either Chinese or Korean, so only American, because that's how my parents talk to each other at home. Went to, all the public schools in the San Francisco County. Then, you said childhood to all the way to where I am. So I'm going to go from the beginning. Then went to Stanford University, where I majored in biology. At Stanford, I actually did undergraduate research for a rare genetic syndrome called velocardiofacial syndrome. It's also known as 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, or DeGeorge syndrome. That's where I got a chance to actually do research with, the leading doctors at Stanford, and then have patient, interactions as well. And that's when I knew I wanted to do medicine. So, I applied for med school, studied as hard as I could for all my classes and the MCATs, went to Duke University School of Medicine, where Duke had a really interesting curriculum where the third year was actually not in the classes, not on the wards or in the clinics, but they dedicated towards research. So for that one research year, I applied for a Howard Hughes Medical Institute Research Fellowship to go back to Stanford and do stem cell research. This is very, pivotal for my career, because with that stem cell research, it involved, embryonic stem cells, which is a controversial topic, but also, fetal tissue derived stem cells. I think that I still think it has a lot of potential for regenerative medicine. I'm sure your crowd it doesn't like that very much, but because it's a controversial topic, what ended up happening is after I completed my fellowship years at Stanford, finished medical school, and started surgical residency at Vanderbilt, I was actually subpoenaed by Congress for that fetal tissue research and stem cell embryonic research I did at Stanford. I still remember I was an intern in general surgery at Vanderbilt. I was spending overnight on the trauma surgery wards, just like, helping gunshot victims, helping stabbing victims, just like exhausted from overnight call. When I came back home to sleep, I heard this, knocking on my door and this pounding, and it said, "This is the police, open up." And I was like, "Oh, like, what's this?" I'm basically a nerd, like I don't do anything illegal. Very boring life. They must have the wrong, address. Maybe there's a drug dealer next door and they got the wrong place. It turns out it was for me, and it was 2 armed U.S. Marshals who said, this is a subpoena from Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, who was the representative in that area. She's like, come report to Congress. This kind of set me up for a lot of like bad, things in my residency program, because as you can imagine, residency is almost like it's like being a part of a military, especially a surgical residency. You have to fit the mold. You don't want to stand out. There's a saying, the nail that sticks up, you have to pound it down with a hammer, right? So that's like what militant surgical residency is. And like, you don't want to have another surgical resident who like, what's this? Like the congressperson in your area is sending U.S. Marshals to this guy's apartment. It was a big deal. It was in the press. It kind of got me unable to finish my surgical residency at Vanderbilt. It was just too difficult to do under those political circumstances, under all of that pressure, all of the like things that you get accused of. But it really came to a head when Donald Trump Jr., because of all this like, political, I would say, I don't know, notoriety that I had achieved from the research I had done, this congressional subpoena, going on NPR, making these like media interviews. I also became active on Twitter at that time, because I was like, how do I defend myself and tell my version of the story when I'm always in like the news headlines for these things? And then so because I became an outspoken activist against Donald Trump Jr. actually went on Twitter and said, like, this is a wife beater, go find him at his hospital, get him fired. It blew up to such a, extent that it was just impossible for me to finish that residency. So I was like, what do I do with the rest of my life? Like I've dedicated my life and career to medicine. Medicine's what I'm passionate about. Where do I go on from here? Right. It was a difficult decision, had some soul searching.
If I stop you there though, so if you don't finish your residency, you don't get your MD. So you have
no. So you get your MD when you finish medical school. And after you finish, I finished 3 years of surgical residency. So that allowed me to be licensed in multiple states. So I'm licensed in, I think, 6 or 7 different states across the nation. And with the medical license, you can actually hire doctors. So you can hire doctors, you can hire nurse practitioners, you can own clinics. Actually, I think there's a saying, you don't get rich by being just a doctor. You get rich by hiring other doctors. And so actually the way that this country is structured, right? If you own businesses and if your businesses hire other doctors, you end up actually being more successful than just being a doctor practicing by yourself. So while I do see patients myself as well, I also am, honored to have other doctors who, work with me and alongside me and own several clinics across the country. So that's kind of how I've made my career in medicine and how I continue to build my career in medicine. But, for a lot of people, if you don't finish residency in surgery and you can't do like, the appendectomies and the, laparoscopic cholecystectomies and all these things in the operating room, and don't work for someone, right? If you can't find a way to become an employer and you're stuck with like being an employee that can't be a useful employee, you're kind of screwed in America, right? So I guess I find myself fortunate that I found a way to be an employer, but there's a lot of other surgical residents who don't find their way in life, and that's pretty unfortunate.
Let me back you up here, because there's certain certain accusations I'm less interested in, despite what other people like salacious stuff. But there's some subject matter that's very interesting. The company that you started, Ganogen, because the subpoena that you got from Blackburn was because potentially, you say like you're a nerd and you haven't done anything illegal, and I'm not saying there's no but to that. The argument, and by all accounts, what you were doing was legal, but some people find it very, very morally objectionable. The company was acquiring fetal tissue from aborted fetuses for the purposes of research, not for profit, which I think is where the legality is drawn in law. But so, I mean, explain that, because like my learning curve on certain subject matter has been radical. The idea that there's a market for fetal tissue was one of the more eye-opening, mind-blowing things for me. What does that look like? Ganogen does research and acquires fetal tissue. What's the mechanism through which a company acquires fetal tissue?
So it was a nonprofit, and we're focused on research. And fetal tissue, believe it or not, it's in almost every medical product you can think of. Like the cell cultures are derived from fetal tissue. It's in pretty much, a lot of the research that we do in medicine is derived from fetal tissue cultured cells. So it may sound gruesome to a lot of your audience, but the thing is, even on the conservative side, a lot of conservative doctors doing research, a lot of their research is predicated upon fetal tissue research. How we got the polio vaccine was because of, fetal tissue kidney cells that were cultured in a dish. And then that's how they kind of incubated the polio virus and found a vaccine for that. So a lot of the vaccines out there are also derived from, fetal tissue research.
Yeah, hence people's religious objections to any product that's derived from aborted fetal tissue. Now, and Dr. Gu, I'm an organ donor. Like, I've signed that part on my card because I believe in that stuff. I understand where people, in principle, could say, well, why not? It's there. It will be scientifically beneficial. Then I very much now understand, and it's almost determinate, that a market is created for this, which leads to corruption, which leads to financial interests, which leads to a whole slew of very nefarious things that turn what would otherwise be using product that might exist for totally independent reasons and creates a market for that, where then you have entities like Planned Parenthood potentially engaging in promoting an activity because there's a market for the fetal tissue afterwards. I mean, is that, am I wrong that that's a very real concern and a very real problem in reality?
So I can understand where your question, comes from, but I think what a lot of people maybe don't fully understand about this whole issue is that this fetal tissue is being discarded every day, whether it's used for research or thrown into the biohazardous, waste bin. That tissue is still, being generated, and you can even, like for myself, nobody celebrates abortion, right? Like, I think every abortion is pretty much a tragedy, right? Like, it was something that causes, either harm to the woman, harm to the fetus, right? It's not an intended pregnancy, and nobody wants that to happen. Nobody wants to make money off of that. It's just like, nobody wants car accidents to happen, right? But you said yourself, you're an organ donor. Like, if God forbid you get into a car accident, and you pass away, right? Like, no one's, people might benefit from some of your like, let's say your heart or your corneas or other parts of your body that you donate, to others to help them. But nobody wants you to die in a car accident, right? Like, I think no researcher wants abortions to happen, but I don't think we can get around the fact that abortions do happen in this country, whether you agree with it or not. It's something that happens, right? It's something that is legal in many states, and where it's legal, it's going to happen, and that tissue is going to be generated and either discarded or used for medical research purposes or other.
I'm bringing this comment up not because it's a legitimate point. Ambulance chasers want car accidents. Now, when you say that nobody wants to make money off of the process, some people do, in as much as there's some lawyers who go around looking for, I mean, stereotypically. As a matter of fact, however, has it not, in fact, and we won't stay up for too long on the subject, but has it not, in fact, created a market where, good people don't want to make money off it? Some of it's going to be there anyhow. It's going to go to waste. May as well make use of it for science. But to the extent that now people can and do make money off of it, you end up creating a lot more of it because you incentivize certain entities potentially to encourage it because there's a market that has been created for it. Does that actually exist in reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I would broaden it out to, when you donate blood, it's an altruistic thing, right? You don't want people to make money off of it. But are there intermediate vendors who probably make profit off of blood donations or, organ donations when you die in a car accident and things like that? I can't say for a certainty that, there aren't people making profit for it. But personally, I think, it should be a nonprofit thing. If you're donating blood or you're donating fetal tissue or you're donating your body if you die in a car accident, I don't think people should profit from a tragedy, right? Or like an altruistic endeavor. I think it should be a nonprofit thing.
I was going to say that, the blood example is a good one because, in fact, they were taking it from prisoners, selling it. It wasn't the best of blood, and it led to all sorts of black market scandals, specifically because it created a market. Is there, satisfy my own curiosity on this, because I've seen reports, is there more of a scientific demand? And I'll say scientific and not monetary, just distinguish the two. Is there more of a scientific demand for the later term, the tissue?
That's an interesting question. I don't think that the age of the tissue, kind of matters for a lot of the research involving fetal tissue because they're interested in the cells, the cell culture that you can get from fetal tissue. They're similar to embryonic stem cells in their development. And yeah, so I guess I don't know the full extent and the answer to that question, but I think there's a lot more fetal tissue that is like created every day in this country, whether you agree with it or not, than there is demand from the researchers. There's far more abortions that happen in this country than the need for the fetal tissue. So it's only the tiniest fraction of that researchers take and grow cell cultures with it. Whether you find that objectionable or not, I don't think we can ban all abortions in this country. Abortion is kind of a fact of life, whether it's in the United States, in Western Europe, and other countries. There are unintended pregnancies that happen, and even if you disagree with it.
And so I'm just wondering, a scientific difference between a 15-week abortion versus I can't do the math, like a 30-week abortion. Is there any scientific difference in the tissue for the purposes of research?
So maybe the tissue may be more developed the later it is, but when it comes to cell culture, you actually want to have the more developmentally, immature, so it has more potential to study how the cells differentiate and can turn into different kinds of cells. So I think for most of fetal research, which is cell culture based, the earlier would be better.
And I'm going to ask you the one darkest question because it's the stuff out of nightmares. Is there, in fact, any, and feel free not to answer, is there any research that is done on non-viable but living aborted fetuses for research purposes?
Yeah, so I can say for like 100% certainty, that would be highly illegal. You can't ever experiment on live human beings. Even if you think that they're not going to survive, you can't do live experimentation on human beings, who are, no matter what age they are. That would be extremely morally objectionable to anybody.
That's an unfortunate. Yeah. It's going to be an unfortunate segue into the jibby jab, the COVID shot. But okay, so that's interesting. I understood it was sort of a controversy about that company and what it was doing, and I know that people in the chat are going to be unforgiving in their positions about abortion, and that's where people will say they'll agree to disagree, except some are going to say, well, these are human lives, and that's where the debate always, meets heads butting. Some people know you, Dr. Gu, as the Trump reply guy, and that's where I think I started noticing you back in the day, where you would always be the first and have the most retweets of any reply guy. I got to ask you this: is it an automated thing? Do you get did you get a notification whenever Trump tweeted, or was someone doing it for you?
What's interesting about that is when Trump tweets, I wouldn't be the first one to reply. It just would, maybe because I had you have a legacy blue check mark as well, right?
Yeah.
Algorithm probably benefited people with the legacy, blue check marks at that time. And I try to have the most thoughtful, not just like, there are some reply guys who would just say the same lines over and over again, but I wanted to be like a critique of what he was saying. So I would actually read what the former president was actually saying, critically think to myself, like, what do I think about his words? Are they outrageous? Do I agree with them? Do I disagree with them? If I disagree with them, why do I disagree with it? And as most critically thinking, intelligent way possible that I could coherently express that. And so that's what I did. And I think people liked some of the replies because they agreed with the rebuttal that I had. It's kind of like when you're on Twitter Spaces, or when we're right here talking on StreamYard, right? It's like, in the moment, you think about what is an intelligent response to that question or to that prompt, and how can you say it in as concise a way as possible. And that's what I tried to do when I was replying to the former president. And I think that was a forum, that was an important forum, because he at that time was the most powerful man in the world, right? With power comes a lot of responsibility. I don't think it's safe in any kind of situation to have such a powerful person have no response, no pushback, and just people agreeing with him. Even if you supported President Trump, like, it helps to have reasonable debate and critique about what he's saying. Just like, right now, President Biden is in control, right? He has a lot of power, a lot of responsibility. I don't agree with every single thing President Biden does, right? I think it's important function for the media or people or influencers to push back against those who are in power, because they have a lot of control over your life. They have a lot of control over the world. We have a right to respond to that, to have our views heard, because they, have a huge platform and they have a lot of ways to affect your life, my life, right? So that's just how I, felt about that situation. And I felt like, since he was the most powerful man in the world, president of the United States, leader of the free world, why not have responses to what he's saying and give the other side?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If we only agree on one thing, I tend to agree that political officials acting in their capacity should not be allowed to block people simply for, replying. For threats and other stuff, yes, but then there's terms of service for that. So, I agreed with you were one of the 7 plaintiffs to the lawsuit seeking to enjoin Trump from having blocked you on Twitter, and it succeeded. I agree with that in principle. Okay, so you made a name for yourself with that, but I think also what is the word, catapulted you into fame or infamy is what is still your profile picture of a doctor, which is you taking the knee and raising the fist in support of Black Lives Matter. You have no problem considering yourself an activist of sorts, correct?
Yeah, and more context about that picture. I think that was before Black Lives Matter even became very prominent. It was in, was it 2016, 2017? It was when taking the knee was extremely unpopular, especially in Tennessee.
For Kaepernick, it wasn't BLM.
Yeah, exactly. When Colin Kaepernick did that, especially down in the Deep South, people hated taking the knee. So I did that because I felt that it was, the right thing to do, and it was the unpopular thing to do. I wasn't, writing some hashtag or some trend. It was a risk to take the knee, and say, you're fighting against racism, you're fighting against white supremacy when you're in Nashville, Tennessee at that time. Then later on, it became like a very popular thing. I saw a lot of doctors, a lot of people, a lot of nurses, taking the knee. It became like the trendy thing to do, a lot of TikTok videos or dancing on it, but like back then, it was actually kind of like a scary thing to do. And it was not going to win you a lot of favors. And so that's the spirit of, why I did that. I felt like it was an important thing to fight for, and it was unpopular. Just like, and I would like to remind you, like when the vaccines for COVID-19 first came out, it was under Operation Warp Speed during the Trump administration. People, even on the liberal side, tend to forget that, but it was under Trump when the vaccines first came out. I was actually hesitant about the vaccines when they first came out, before we had any evidence and data on the vaccines, right? That was when they just did that pilot study that like I think Pfizer did a pilot study that was published in New England Journal, but that was not very many patients. We didn't have a lot of data on whether it was safe and effective at that time. And I actually did a series of tweets talking about how, like, I'm vaccinated for against tetanus, against chickenpox, all these other vaccines, measles, mumps, rubella, but I'm not yet vaccinated against COVID-19, even though I'm eligible for it, because I want to find out more data on that. And I had a lot of other friends who are doctors too, who we were all a little bit hesitant about when their vaccines first rolled out in I think it was at the end of 2020, right? It was very fast development of the vaccines. I didn't know much about it at all. And, I'm, as a critical thinker, I was like, yeah, I need more data. The reason why now I'm more supportive of the vaccines is because I feel like 71% of the world have now been vaccinated, right? I think more than 5 billion people have received the vaccines. That's a huge, large amount of data on like a lot of people, and not just in one geographical region, but we're talking around the world. The United States, Germany, China, Russia, everywhere. Like, a lot of people have been vaccinated. And at that large scale, if there was something deadly wrong with the vaccines, you would see that. And I would argue, like, I know a lot of your supporters think that, oh, you do see it in all these sudden cardiac deaths, the myocarditis and things like that. But when I look at it objectively and take a look at just like the whole big picture, does myocarditis happen? Yes. Do sudden cardiac deaths happen? Yes. Are there adverse reactions to vaccines? Yes. But you have to take a look at the proportion of that and how rare it is when 5 billion people have it. So the 5 billion is a large number. And if 500 people have adverse events, but there are 5 billion people who have the vaccine, then it would be considered a very rare event.
Well, and we'll deal with the white supremacy stuff another time, because we only have, now this is the crux of the discussion. Okay. At first, I don't know what your history was in the beginning about skepticism, but vaccine, you're using the word vaccine, and a lot of people, I think, rightly take issue with vaccine. How can you call something that doesn't prevent contracting, carrying, or transmitting a virus a vaccine that is not made from, I forget what the term is, dead virus particles. I forget the term for the Johnson & Johnson versus Pfizer. How can you refer to something that does not prevent carrying, contracting, or transmitting a virus as being a vaccine?
That's a very, very good question. And I think that's a legitimate question, and the vaccines are not as effective as we had originally hoped, right? And some say because the virus, mutates. First, you had the Delta variant, the original variants, and then the Omicron variant, and it keeps mutating to evade the vaccines. I do believe that, that is occurring. The hope was the vaccines would take us completely out of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I am also disappointed with the fact that the vaccines, I had hoped that it would prevent you from getting sick, prevent you from contracting COVID, prevent you from transmitting COVID to others. Like, that was the whole premise of why we should vaccinate, children and younger individuals who weren't as much at risk from, the morbidity and mortality of COVID-19 as elderly patients, because they would, being vaccinated, have a less likelihood of, transmitting the virus. The fact that you can be vaccinated and then you can still contract COVID, you can still pass COVID on to others, that made that argument far less salient, even to me. So I would admit, the vaccines have not been as effective as we originally hoped that they would be, right? Like, I was vaccinated and I still got COVID. So
well, you might get it more often now that I won't make any medical determinations, but here's the problem, or at least bringing it back to, with the fetal tissue, can't experiment on living beings. Obama said it quite eloquently. The NIH had it on their website. This was an experimental gene therapy. They called it a vaccine, but I take issue with the term. But Obama effectively admitted, not effectively, he admitted unequivocally that they had just, done clinical trials at a global level. Try to explain to somebody how this wasn't, in fact, experimental gene therapy at a global scale of a population with a product that had not been around long enough to make any of the affirmations that medical professionals were making at the time they were coercing people to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it kind of, that's why I'd like to circle back to those tweets that I made when the vaccines first rolled out. That was exactly what was on my mind too, which is we've only had I think at the time the narrative was there was a lot of years of animal studies on these, messenger RNA vaccines, but animal studies are not the same as human studies. I would freely admit that you need to know what the side effects are, what are the long-term effects, what are the benefits, what are the risks in human beings. And you can't just say this is a proven science because we did it in a bunch of rats or a bunch of guinea pigs in the laboratory or in a petri dish. And so because of years and decades of research in animals, that's the reason. I think that was a narrative at that time, which I actually disagreed with. So it's a good question. What are the ethics of getting this extremely fast development and rollout of these, messenger RNA vaccines, and then using emergency use authorization, as well as, I think, piggybacking on a lot of fear that people had about COVID-19, right? Like, I have never in my life experienced what it feels like to be almost like, you see in the movies, a zombie apocalypse or something.
Contagion.
All these
Contagion was the
lockdowns.
best.
It really transformed a lot of people's lives, right? It changed society. Do you remember the time when you would go to the grocery store and all the toilet paper would be gone, all the eggs, all the milk? There'd be these huge lines, and it looked like.
I remember in Montreal, the train would go by and the train was empty, but it was still running. I mean, it was contagion level insanity. But Dr. Gu, this is the problem. I don't want to go back and pull up all of your tweets where you said, where you tweeted affirmations which have aged poorly, to say the least. And it's like, it came from the Twitter space where you said, I don't know, at the time, I don't know how they pushed this through so quickly and told us it was safe. But then I subsequently said safe and effective, subsequently supported vaccine mandates, subsequently supported potential doctors losing licenses if they don't comply. I'm trying to think of the other
I'd like
one.
to correct you on that. So I've never supported, and have your followers, dig up my tweets. They're pretty good at doing that. Vaccine mandates, because I believe in, informed consent. Definitely, I've always been against vaccine mandates. So I just wanted people to have the choice after they, think about it themselves, talk with their own doctors, their own pediatricians, their own internal medicine or family medicine doctors, whether to get vaccinated or not. And if patients don't want to get vaccinated, that's their informed consent, and to respect that decision too.
I'm gonna have to circle back and circle back to the question, which is,
Sure.
It is a good question. How could they get it so wrong, and how could the medical community go along with it? Because it's not Albert Bourla coming out and saying 100% effective, April 1st, 2021. And then subsequently trying to spin that, I didn't mean 100% effective at preventing COVID. I meant preventing serious COVID. The whole mentality, the framework, the philosophy behind vaccine mandates is, when little Jimmy gets the vax, he's protecting Granny. They said it. That was the basis for coercing, extorting people into getting vaccinated. How could the medical community have gotten it so wrong by citing studies which they then later on admitted they never conducted? And some people are going to blame you, Dr. Gu, and I won't. I'll give you a bit of grace, because I don't think you were aware of what Pfizer was or was not doing. But how did the medical community blindly go along with what Pfizer subsequently admitted they never even did by way of testing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer to that, the pandemic felt kind of like a war. It felt like something where, when you have a lot of people in like the millions scared about something, to the point that, all the news reports, everything on the TV, on the radio, on social media, you had doctors going on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, right, talking about how people are dying in New York City, that so many bodies are piling up, that the U-Haul trucks were being full of bodies, and they were leaking their bodily juices everywhere and decaying. It felt like the end of the world. And so I think with that high level of fear, which probably went out of proportion to reality, right? Like, just like in war is scary. But during war, don't people in power take advantage of people's fear to basically do an abuse of power? It happens over and over again. And if you think of the COVID-19 pandemic as like a war, even though there's no like external country that was an enemy, we were at war. We were at war with COVID-19, and people were scared. And so people in power, and also the medical community too, like that fear gives people a lot of power, right? Those who are in charge can use that fear and say, hey, everybody get vaccinated. Everybody lock yourselves down. Look what happened in China. They completely lock down Shanghai and the big cities, and nobody could even go out to get food, right? Like when people are scared and there's a lot of hysteria that's out of proportion, you're going to have people in power abuse that and kind of take down a lot of civil liberties that we're used to during peacetime. And I think that happened during COVID-19. No question about it.
Well, I mean, the thing is this: if you were to have made that very same statement, but from, let's call it, the other side of the aisle, in critique of the doctors who made the recommendations that you made, people would agree with you. The problem here is, like, I agree with everything you just said. World War II, time of war, time of crisis, that's when you justified locking up Japanese citizens in internment camps. It's a stain on the history of the world. I can get other examples. Wartime, panic time is when atrocities are committed. And a lot of people view what the medical community did here as an atrocity. I want to come back to one other thing. We said, they've vaccinated 5 billion people. You're not seeing it. But with excess mortality, and maybe you can explain this in a way that contradicts my understanding of it or that of Dr. Malhotra, who I had on the other day. Excess mortality, predominantly in more heavily vaccinated countries, even in Sweden, where you have excess mortality that's not dipping below excess mortality despite the culling of the weak and the vulnerable that a pandemic typically brings. We are seeing it. I mean, unless you disagree with that reassessment of the randomized clinical trial from Pfizer, which basically showed a 1 in 800 risk of adverse events of special interest, we are seeing it not on, I don't know how much more of a catastrophic scale we need to, but how do you explain the excess mortality at the endemic stage and not during the pandemic stage, if not to attribute it to, at least in part, presumptively, to the jab?
That's a great question. And I think the beauty about science is even though science can be hijacked by politicians and those in power and the fear mongers at the time, science is always around, even after the pandemic is over. Science is around to examine what was done in the past. So I say that because this excess mortality question, it's not a question that's going to go away, right? Right now, I don't think that it has reached a threshold for me to definitively say, okay, excess mortality is because of the vaccine. There are so many confounding factors. Could excess mortality be because we were all locked down, eating junk food at home, not exercising, the gyms are closed, like eating cheeseburgers all day?
Yeah, they promised you cheeseburgers to get vaccinated, Dr. Gu. That was science.
For that too. I was like, why give donuts for vaccines? That's totally bullshit. But there was craziness on all sides, I think, during the pandemic. I would definitely admit to that. But because there's so many confounding factors and this evidence of excess mortality, I want it to be seen in a very objective manner. I think there are a lot of people.
Let's just get objective. You concede. You recognize there is excess mortality. I won't say. Well, you recognize there's excess mortality.
I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot from the conservative side, or the opposing aisle side. But I haven't seen definitive evidence, just from a lot of the main journals, New England Journal, Lancet, all these other things that the medical community kind of by default just realized. I know that's not perfect, right?
No, but Eugene, actually, can I call you Eugene? I don't want to be disrespectful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You're relying on the Lancet. The Lancet is the same journal that said it was a racist conspiracy theory to suggest that the Rona was concocted in a lab in Wuhan, China. 18 months later, says it's always been a perfectly viable theory. Had to retract a number of articles. You're relying on the compromised, the institutions that you now admit are compromised to provide the evidence so that you can come to further conclusions when you recognize that they are compromised. How does that work?
Yeah, I know that's a really great question because, if you take a look at every single mainstream institution, whether it's Lancet, New England Journal, FDA, CDC, everybody has nobody's perfect, right? They all make mistakes. But what's the alternative? Like when you're taking a look at, let's say you're just a country doctor in the community and you need to rely on some reliable, consensus sources, would you say, okay, because the FDA made this mistake, or because the Lancet made this mistake, I'm going to completely disregard it. I'm going to go to this preprint like journal where it's not peer reviewed, and a lot of garbage comes out. Like there's a ton of garbage that gets printed out in those preprint journals too. And if you take a look at the mistakes any journal or any kind of institution makes, there are too many to count, right? So do you pick and choose which ones you hear? Do you listen to a social media influencer? Do you listen to Steve Kirsch? Everybody is not going to be perfect. Everybody's going to have a history of making mistakes. So that's why.
Yeah, but let me push back hard there. There's a difference between making a mistake and being a corrupt, compromised institution. When the Lancet didn't make mistakes, they are a corrupt, compromised institution, and I'm not ever going to go back to rely on them ever. And it's not just that. They're corrupt and compromised, and then they stifle free speech and try to go after the licenses of doctors that do try to call them out on it. So I wouldn't even call what Fauci did a mistake. It was lies and deceit. And once someone has lied to you about the necessity of wearing a mask, about the gain of function, I would never rely on them ever again. What do you do? That's the question, because they've screwed up the foundations of trust in science and trust in doctors, even the good ones. But you, who ignore, and this is what struck me about the Twitter Spaces, is you said, I don't know why CNN would have told me that the ivermectin, which one was the horse paste? Ivermectin.
Yeah, ivermectin.
I don't know why they would have done that. I don't know why Dr. Gupta would have come out and said the same thing. I don't know why Moderna wouldn't have shared their the inefficacy of their booster. You don't know why.
Well, I do know why, and I think this explanation I hope will make sense to you and also to your audience. I don't think that they intentionally lied and to be evil and just like screw everybody. I think what happened was they knew what was popular with their audience. Just like, what's popular with your audience. Sanjay Gupta probably knows what's popular with his liberal audience, right? To denigrate ivermectin as horse dewormer, it was popular, right, among liberal circles. So what happens, and whether it's Sanjay Gupta, whether it's CNN, whether it's MSNBC, whether it's Rachel Maddow or Bill O'Reilly, people are going to say what's popular to their group, their tribe. Sometimes it's not intentionally like they're lying. Maybe the mistake is they don't have enough hard evidence to back up what they're saying, but they know it's popular. So there's temptation to just say something even without the solid proof, but they think it could be true, right? Like they think it could be true. They don't have solid proof, but it's going to be really popular with my people. So I'm going to go, I'm going to go on CNN and say, ivermectin is a horse dewormer. It's bullshit. It's not going to work. And I don't think ivermectin was particularly effective against COVID. I'm not going to think it's horse dewormer, but you know what I mean? Like everybody has an audience and they're going to play to that audience. And that's what
I'll just say one thing. I know what's popular with my audience, and it's the truth. And even if I agree with you on certain, entertainers, the Rachel Maddows, I don't go to Rachel Maddow for advice, but some people do. But where people are not supposed to cater to the interests of their audience or the interests of their financiers is science and medicine. And what we've seen is the exact opposite. And yet those are the institutions that some doctors like yourself still rely on for the truth when you know that they've been lying to you and you recognize that they've been lying to you. And so when do you just say, you once a fool, shame on you, whatever the expression is, when do you say I can't trust anything you're saying? And not only that, I can trust that you're probably lying now.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, science should, like exactly what you said, science should be about the truth, not what is popular, not what you think can win you the most points or whatever narrative you're trying to push. Science is based on evidence, and the evidence is objective, right? Evidence it's not right, it's not left. It's always just like reflecting what reality tells you. And I think that's something that both the right and the left should always center themselves on. Sometimes the evidence and reality is not convenient for your narrative. When that happens, you have to be true to yourself. You have to be true. The ethical thing to do at that point is just like, hey, the objective truth here, even though, for instance, I would give you one example. I wish that the vaccines were so effective that it would prevent transmission and prevent you from getting COVID and getting sick, right? So that's a narrative, right? That's what I want to be true. But when I look at the evidence, I got COVID after I was, vaccinated and boosted. I didn't get too sick, so maybe, that reducing hospitalizations part could be true.
You're a young, healthy person. You're not obese. You probably have no one to set that aside.
but you know what I'm saying, right? It's that even though I want the vaccines to be 100% effective, I know reality tells me they're not. right? You could still get sick with COVID. You could still die from COVID with the vaccine. So that's where the reality and the truth comes in. You have to always tell your audience, or tell your patients, or tell the truth, not what you want the truth to
But
be,
Eugene,
what the truth actually is.
they didn't. The scientific community didn't. And at first they said it prevents transmission. And then when it didn't, they said these are breakthrough cases. And then when everyone got the breakthrough case, they said, yeah, we never even tested for transmissibility. And these are the institutions that on the one hand you're relying on, and that on the other hand are imposing I'll say real-time experimentation on humans.
Yeah.
How do you? This is what irritated me the most, and I hope you don't. You seem like a thick-skinned individual, so this is not going to be the worst thing you've heard all day. When you kept saying during the Twitter Spaces, it's safe and effective, and I'm like, define safe and define effective, because right now we know it's not effective, and we know some of us seem to think it's not that safe. What is your definition of safe and what is your definition of effective? Not at large, not with respect to the jibby jab.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my definition of effective would be that it, not only prevents you from, dying from COVID and getting hospitalized, but also from you getting COVID and transmitting it to others, right? Like that's, the whole mantra was we're all in this together. We're gonna sacrifice for the greater good of society and together end the pandemic. It would be great if the vaccines were very effective at preventing transmission. It looks like the data and the evidence shows that you can still transmit COVID and get sick from COVID with the vaccines, right?
They were letting vaccinated employees who were unknowingly carrying the virus work while banning unvaccinated employees who tested negative. That's as much trust the science as we can hope for. But yeah, sorry. So we now know that it doesn't prevent it. So where do you go on effective then?
So yeah, so I guess there's a shifting goalpost phenomenon that I'm seeing too here, right? And like, so that's where the reality and the objectiveness of it, comes in. In the very beginning, before they knew that you could, get sick while having the vaccine, without evidence, they were saying you can't transmit COVID when you get the vaccine, that it was 100% effective. That turned out to be not true. And then now the goalpost changed in that the virus mutates, you get the Omicron, you had different variants coming out. And so they evade the vaccines. And so that's why we always knew that this would happen. I think though, I would agree with you in the beginning, there was a huge narrative that the vaccines would prevent transmission and that if we all get vaccinated, we could end the pandemic together. And I hope that was true too, but it just,
Eugene, they lied to you. They lied to me. They came out afterwards and said, we never even tested for transmissibility. How do you ever go back to trusting them again? And why do they not deserve to be in jail for that level of fraud and real-time human experimentation?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we would agree on a definition, disagree on the definition of what constitutes a lie there. I think what they did was they hoped that the vaccines would prevent transmission.
No. What they did is they made a statement of affirmative fact, knowing that they hadn't even tested to support that statement of affirmative fact. There's two types of lies. One is saying something that you know is wrong, and one is saying something as a fact that you have no reason to believe or know is true as a fact. The moon is made of cheese. I have no way of affirming it.
For it to be a lie is if they had knowingly known at that time that getting vaccinated, you could still transmit the virus. So they knew either way. That's what I'm saying. Like they hoped that the best case scenario would bear fruit, which is that you get vaccinated against COVID-19 and then you are no longer able to transmit it. There was no evidence.
They weren't testing for it. How could they have ever said it?
Right. So that's why I think they were hoping. Okay. And they tested it in this very small, too small number of patients for it to reflect actual reality. So that's kind of what happened. So, but that's not an intentional lie, right?
I think they were
hoping that it was true, and then they kind of like over exaggerated what they knew at that time, right?
Yeah, they were hoping it's true while getting massive government contracts and shielded from liability for saying something that they had no reason to believe to be true. So, all right. So let's bottom line. Do we now acknowledge it's not effective?
So it's not as effective as we had originally hoped, but the evidence, right, from the large number of people, it does show that it reduces the severity of the disease for those who do contract COVID. It's not perfect, right, but it's better than nothing. And so that's why in the Twitter Spaces, on this interview, I still think based on all the data that we have amassed so far, which is quite a bit. 71% of the world population has been vaccinated. The benefits of the vaccine do outweigh the risks for most of the people. An argument could be made like, children, do the benefits outweigh the risks? The jury is still out on that.
Well, let me stop you there. Is the jury out? Do you recognize or do you agree with that study? It was in the NICB, whatever it is, that they reassessed the numbers, the figures from Pfizer and Moderna, and they acknowledge that the risks of a adverse event of special interest is 1 in 800. Do you agree with that number, or do you not agree with that number?
So I don't know all the numbers just off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up and refresh my memory. But I will say this, like, we've always known that the risk of COVID for children was far less than it is for, age 65 plus. And the whole premise of why do we vaccinate everybody is to, prevent transmission of COVID as a whole. So if you vaccinate kids, they can't spread it to grandma at home, and that was a valid point until now. We know with the different variants coming out, how they can evade, these vaccines even. Do the risks, do the benefits of the vaccine, are they worth it for children? And I think, that's something that we need to keep on examining the data, reviewing it.
But Eugene,
pediatricians, should make that determination in conjunction with the parents.
Examining the data means testing on children in real time. That's what it means. I mean, is that wrong?
So that's actually a pretty good question, and something that I would like to kind of think about, even after we're done with this interview, something I can ponder about in my head. Children, pregnant women, they're very prisoners. Those three groups are extremely vulnerable. What are the ethics of testing, emergency use authorization therapeutics or vaccines on those vulnerable populations? It's already been rolled out to them, in society. So like the general medical consensus might be right now today, hey, it was fine. It was a pandemic. It was an emergency situation. We wanted to save as many lives as possible. We had good intent. But, many years down the road, when we examine, what occurred, what has occurred, what's occurring now, I think we always have to put those three groups first and foremost in terms of, do we, what are the ethics around that? I don't know the answer to that. I know your audience knows the answer to that.
Oh, no, well, we once upon a time, for obvious reasons, believed in the Nuremberg Code, but set aside that sort of what could be hyperbolic rhetoric. You do recall the time. You do recall a time in this pandemic when they denied that it caused myocarditis in children?
Yeah, I think in the very beginning, before all the data came out and the more cases came out,
Okay.
I don't know exactly, but it sounds very plausible to me that they would deny. They deny a lot of things. They deny that the menstrual cycle doesn't.
Well, look, I'm gonna get you in trouble because I'm just gonna ask you whether or not you, based on your understanding of the data, as a doctor, because you do have training that most of us don't. We now, I'll say we, so we'll both get in trouble. We acknowledge it has interference with women's menstrual cycle, correct? Or potential.
It affects the menstrual cycle. Yes. So I think there's been studies that came out for, reputable, even the CDC or FDA, they acknowledge that.
Yeah, sure. Well, when they can't hide it anymore, they got to acknowledge it and spin it. And say we've always said it, like they did in the UK. But
I do remember a bunch of doctors, on Twitter and going on mainstream media, at CNN, MSNBC, they said that was like totally bullshit, gaslighting,
conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it was a conspiracy theory that affects menstrual cycle. That any woman experiencing that is a total nut job or wacko or crazy, and like it turned out that that's not the case, right? So that also aggravates me too. You can't invalidate people's experiences. And if they're saying that my menstrual cycle changed or I missed a period or whatever, because of the vaccine, and to say that, you're crazy person, that's unbecoming of any kind of medical professional to say that.
Not just that, but it's experimenting on people in real time. Let me ask you this though. I'm just a hypochondriac neurotic. If something interferes with a menstrual cycle, it stands to reason it could as well, by extension, interfere with reproduction, breastfeeding, and the like. Is that not a far stretch?
Like whether it affects fertility or not, you could make an argument it affects the menstrual cycle.
It has to.
Fertility. It might, right? I can't say that yes, absolutely yes or absolutely no, right? I would say you need to like investigate that further. In terms of breastfeeding, I don't think it affects, breastfeeding. I don't think they had evidence that it's like dangerous for breastfeeding or anything like that. But there's a lot of things that affect the menstrual cycle. One of which is when you have an inflammatory response, or when a woman has a stress response, that also affects the menstrual cycle. And the reason for that is because when you have like stress hormones, it affects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. There's something called a gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, that gets affected by cortisol levels, stress levels. When like there's the interplay between the stress hormones and the menstrual cycle. And so that's what possibly happened with the COVID-19 vaccines. But I don't know for sure. I don't think anyone knows exactly for sure.
The purpose of my question was only to illustrate that it's part of a bigger system. So if something can potentially interfere or have an impact on menstrual cycle, it's within the sphere of reproduction.
Yeah, it's something that we should investigate and find out what the actual truth is objectively. Yeah. Right.
What number are you prepared to concede is the risk of myocarditis for young men aged 18 to 39? 1 in 5,000 per dose, 1 in 800 per dose? Like what are you prepared to concede is the risk for that?
Yeah, so I think one of the papers that I kind of cited in the Twitter Spaces and always draw to is that there's a large study with I think it's like around 5 million patients. And that number, and when they looked at the most vulnerable age group, which was younger males in their teenage years, it was 2.5 out of 100,000. So that was their determination of the risk of myocarditis. And I would say that if it's 2.5 individuals per 100,000 cases, that is a really low rare adverse event. Not that it doesn't happen, it happens, right? If you have 5 billion doses, 2.5 out of 100,000, you have quite a few people with myocarditis. But you have to take a look at what's on the denominator of the equation, right? There's so many people who have it. Driving your car down the street is not without risk, right?
Yeah, but at least it yields me some benefit. But we'll have to disagree on that number, because there was a study that came out of Canada, and I think the general consensus now at the best case scenario is 1 in 5,000 per dose. But we'll agree to disagree on that. Dr. Go, I know you're running short on time. Do you know anybody who suffered an adverse reaction on a personal level?
So I don't know anyone. My whole family, myself, all my patients got vaccinated. The only adverse event that I have seen is, some of them have like a lot of like aches and chills in their joints, and they have a night or two of having a fever or feeling like you have the flu. That was a bit quite common. I think even my wife, after she got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that night she felt like she had the flu. She was kind of like ran a temperature. But then she recovered from that, and there was no adverse events after that. And after that one night of suffering, there was nothing else that ever happened. We never had any kind of myocarditis, any kind of.
But they pulled the Johnson or they phased out the rollout of Johnson & Johnson for blood clots for women in particular.
Yeah, so that was before that came out. But what you're talking about with Johnson & Johnson, there was a rare side effect of cerebral sinus thrombosis. So in your brain, it caused a clot in some people's brains. It sounds very scary, and that's why they kind of phased that out and went more towards the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines.
Do we not find something shockingly acknowledging that they rolled out the Johnson & Johnson after having rolled it in, saying it was safe and effective?
Yeah, I mean that's what can I say? That's a good question to have, right? Like, if it was really 100% safe, then you wouldn't have like phased out the Johnson & Johnson.
Well, or if it had been properly tested, it would have never been phased out it would have never been implemented to be phased out afterwards because of risks that occurred in real time, because of what we acknowledged as improper real-time human experimentation. Let me ask you this question. 1 minute left.
Sure.
Is the ghost vaccine a thing? Is it the case that some people are administering saline solution vaccines because they don't want to subject themselves to the risk of the jibby jab?
I actually haven't heard of that too much. This ghost vaccine. Are you saying like some pharmacist or some
too much or never? I'm saying I have heard from credible sources that in positions of high power executives who themselves do not want to be subjected to their own vaccine mandates implement what is called a ghost vaccine or a saline solution, or they just squirt it up in the air and give them the card, throw out the vial so everything checks up on the paper. Have you heard about people doing that?
I haven't, but that would be wild to that would be very concerning to me if that were true. I haven't heard that. I'm hearing it from you for the first time. But if a Pfizer person like didn't want to use their own vaccine and kind of faked it, that would be a scandal to me too. Like I would be pissed off at that.
Now, again, I could keep you here as long as you can stay, but I know you got. How much time do you have left?
Yeah, I should run, but maybe one last question, and then
Okay.
I have to. Yeah.
How many times do you have to acknowledge you've been deceived by the powers that govern your profession and that basically give you the advice to give before you say, I no longer trust you now, and now I'm going to speak out against you? Will it happen? Can it happen? Or do you even, is there too much pressure on you for that to ever happen?
That's a good question. I mean, like, the medical community has made many mistakes way before the COVID-19, pandemic ever happened. There's been so many mistakes the medical community has made and ethical lapses. You've heard of thalidomide with pregnant women to cure morning sickness, and it caused, deformities in children. There in the 1960s, I believe, at Vanderbilt, they actually gave pregnant women radioactive iron. And it caused a lot of deformities and stillborn deaths in babies. There's a lot of Tuskegee medical experiments, right? They didn't treat syphilis in African Americans, and they had this horrible sequelae of that disease. Nuremberg, right? The medical community has made many mistakes in the past. It's not a perfect community, but that doesn't mean you throw out everything. You can't just say, okay, because of this mistake or because something happened in history, now I'm not going to believe in medicine at all. I'm not going to go to a doctor. I don't believe in any kind of therapeutics. That would be dangerous too, right? I think we need balance.
Well, yeah, but I'm not,
bad things that have happened.
Well, I'm not talking about the whole medical system at large, but with this particular shot, they've lied. Now you've been sort of compelled to concede they've misled. Whether or not you think it was a lie, they've misled. They've misrepresented. They've been given immunity while they do it. There's been risks that they now acknowledge that they previously denied. When do you take a stand against this particular jab as opposed to continuing to assert that it's safe and effective and the benefits outweigh the risks? I mean, how do we need to see thalidomide children at this point, knowing what you've already acknowledged they have misrepresented up to now? Do you need to wait more to see more bad stuff before you say I should never have trusted them, and now I want to say put pressure on them to put a halt on these mandates that they're still pushing in Canada and the States?
Yeah. So I guess the one thing that we may not agree on is, how bad the adverse events are. My stance, and based on the evidence and examining it, is that adverse events do happen, but they're rare. I think your stance and your audience would say, like, there's so many adverse events and they're not rare, right? That we kind of disagree on that.
Dr. Kieran Moore out of Canada, he couldn't be more lefty if he tried. He's a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, but they acknowledge 1 in 5,000 for young men. How can you then stand by any government that imposes it as a mandate, as a recommendation? How do you support a government, the CDC, adding it to the children's recommended list, knowing that certain states are going to implement it? How can you sit there and tolerate that, knowing everything that you have acknowledged now?
Well, I mean, I don't agree with the mandate, so I don't think the government should mandate these things. I think every patient deserves informed consent, and so what I would say is every patient should have the freedom, based on the information that that they receive, talking to their pediatrician, talking to their family medicine doctor, making the decision for themselves, or the parents, like informing themselves and making that decision. So I want every patient or the parents of the children to make their own independent, informed decision, and that should not be coerced. That should not be mandated by the government. And if they make that choice, like, it's neither my place or your place or anyone else's place other than the patient or the parent and the pediatrician and the doctor to make that decision amongst themselves. So just give people the freedom to have the choice, and don't punish people if that choice doesn't align with what your values are, right? So I have patients who don't want to get vaccinated, and I respect that. If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice, right? I'm still going to give you the best quality medical care. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to try to cancel you or anything like that. I think that we just need to get back to, why not just have everybody have their own freedom? Get vaccinated or not, that's your choice, but don't impose our values on others.
Okay, and one last one. What do you think? What do you say about the CDC adding this to the recommended list of vaccines for children?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know what to fully make of that yet, because on the one hand, I think that they have, good intentions, but they want to, like, protect as many people as possible, and they think that it'll save as many lives as possible. The benefit versus risk ratio for children is different than it is for elderly patients.
Do you would acknowledge it's negative for children?
I don't know if it's necessarily negative, but it's definitely more of a question to have, because children, when they get COVID-19, they're not subjected to as much morbidity and mortality as an 80-year-old grandmother, right?
I think they're subjected to strictly zero. I don't even think there was one under 12 in Canada that died from the virus itself, except there was that 14-year-old kid who had stage 4 brain cancer.
And on top of that, the virus mutates. So, is a vaccine against the Delta variant going to be effective against this XBB 1.5 or whatever?
You say the number. I pictured Jimmy Fallon, XBB 1.
But yeah, I mean, so that's why I think the jury is out to that. I don't know exactly where my stance is on that, because the virus is continuing to mutate. Maybe the vaccines won't be as effective as when new variants come out. So mandating it recommended for children, that's a gray area for me.
All right, I'll give you the spoiler alert: corruption and money. And in a year's time, Eugene, we'll do this again, and we'll add a few more elements to the list of things that we'll see we'll see where you are in a year, because I genuinely think you're. It's the Mark Twain. It's easier to fool people than it is to convince them they've been fooled. And you have faith in an institution that has been spitting in your face for the last 3 years, and you have a difficulty, like with a parent, detaching yourself from that abusive relationship, because that's what it was, and you still want to believe that they're good and that they did everything. They did the wrong things for the right reasons. I see a shimmer of light, but maybe I'm just projecting. But Dr. Gu, thank you very much. Whether or not the chat likes what you said, they heard it, and those who ducked out early because they didn't want to be exposed to someone who says things that they find radically offensive and disagree with, you missed out. People will see what you said. The truth shall prevail, and that's it. Doctor, I'm gonna end this with you, and we'll say our proper goodbyes afterwards. I want to thank you publicly for having done this, because you're more courageous than many. I think you've made more concessions than most would make. I would be concerned that your side is going to come, you might have said too many things, and now people are going to question too much. They shouldn't do their own research and yada yada. But I think we've made headway anyhow. So, Dr. Gu, thank you.
I enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you. Stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone else out there, thank you. See you tomorrow, people.